everyone. I'm Tamika Brown-Nagan, the Dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study here at Harvard. Welcome to the annual Kim and Judy Davis Dean's Lecture in the Social Sciences, this year featuring Dr. Alondra Nelson, President of the Social Science Research Council and Professor of Sociology at Columbia University. I'm delighted to have Alondra here with us today and thrilled that all of us have the opportunity to hear from her. Let me extend a special welcome to Kim Davis and members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society, as well as our generous annual donors who make the work of the Institute possible. Thank you for your support. Alondra Nelson is an acclaimed scholar and distinguished leader, both in academia and in the world of policy. She's also a respected public intellectual who frequently devotes her intellectual firepower to advancing racial and social justice. Alondra pushes her fellow social scientists to be similarly engaged with the world, encouraging researchers, to quote Alondra, ask the hard questions about the public good, reach new audiences, and communicate effectively and emphatically. Alondra's own scholarly work in women and gender studies, as well as African American studies, sits at the intersection of science, technology, medicine, and inequality. She investigates how science shapes the world we inhabit, exploring questions of identity, collective action, and our engagement with scientific conceptualizations of race, ethnicity, gender, and much more. Alondra's latest book, The Social Life of DNA, Race, Reparations, and Reconciliation After the Genome, results from a decade plus of ethnographic research on direct-to-consumer genetic ancestry testing. Beginning in the early 2000s, long before ancestry tests became mainstream, let alone advertised as holiday gifts, Alondra set out to learn why people take them and what they might tell us about who we are and who others think we are. In particular, she wondered why African Americans were among the earliest adopters of this new technology. The Social Life of DNA explains how individual genetic information gathered from take-at-home tests became a socio-political catalyst. Newly accessible genetic data have not only been used for ancestral root seeking, but also to expose aspects of societal amnesia around American slavery. Some African Americans turned to the test to reckon with, to quote Alondra, the unfinished business of slavery and its lasting shadows of racial discrimination and economic inequality. Yet, as she cautions, DNA can offer an avenue towards recognition, but cannot stand in for reconciliation, which encompasses voice, acknowledgement, mourning, forgiveness, and healing. Alondra's earlier award-winning book, titled Body and Soul, The Black Panther Party and the Fight Against Medical Discrimination, examines a related set of issues through the lens of the little-known health activism of the Black Panthers. In Body and Soul, Alondra tells the fascinating history of the Black Panthers community clinics, including the country's first grassroots genetic screening program, which was set up to test for sickle cell anemia. Currently, Alondra is at work on a new book on science and technology policy in the Obama administration, and it is the subject of her talk today. Alondra began her teaching career at Yale University after earning a PhD in American Studies from New York University. Since 2009, she's been on the faculty at Columbia, where she's also served as director of the Institute for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality, inaugural Dean of Social Science, and founding co-chair of the Precision Medicine and Society program. She also spearheaded Columbia University's participation in the Obama administration's collaborative to advance equity through research. Today, as president of the Social Science Research Council, Alondra leads national and international efforts to advance research for the public good, and works to mobilize scholarship and resources to tackle pressing questions with implications for policy, equity, science, and much more. It's hard to imagine a better person for this critical work and for today's lecture. And now please join me in welcoming Alondra Nelson to the stage.
Thank you so much, Dean Brown-Nagin, for that incredibly generous introduction. And special greetings to a few people. I was so happy to have so many dear friends here. I want to thank, as I begin, Kim Davis. I'm delighted to be here under the auspices of the Kim and Judy Davis Dean's Lecture. I want to send special greetings to Daniel Carpenter, who I know plays a special role here at the Radcliffe in the social sciences. And I have to say, those of you who study bureaucracy or the state, as I'm trying to do for the very first time, we would be completely lost without Daniel and without his work on the FDA and other regulatory capture and the like. Greetings to Marina Whitman, who's a member of the SSRC Advisory Board, visiting committee who's here, and I think a Radcliffe alum. And also to two of the most important mentors in my life, Evelyn Hammonds and Patricia Williams, who I'm delighted to see and who have supported me quite literally for decades. I think I would not have tenure without either of them, truth be told. So, I've been busy doing administrative work, but I think one must always do our research. It's the thing that brings us to graduate school. It's that, the questions that we have about the world. And so I'm working at a more glacial pace than would be desired, but I am working nonetheless and have been spending about the last year and a half talking to staffers in the Obama administration, starting mostly with junior staffers who worked, many of them across the whole 8 years of the administration and continuing forward. So I'm going to tell you a story. I think that'll be a wistful story for some of you about the recent past and give you some ideas about, it's too soon to, I think, make any proclamations about the legacy of the Obama administration, but I just want to make some gestures about what I think was particularly important with regards to their work, that administration's work with science and technology. So I told you to be a little wistful. Here are two images. One of the very first magazine covers of the Obama era, paging Dr. Obama, obviously a time cover about the Affordable Care Act and all of the controversy and political debate that would come with it, and his very last cover from Popular Science, in which he did an interview kind of summing up his work in the administration, and in particular talking about science. So in that arc, from the beginning to the end, it's easy to gather data, if one looks, about how this was probably one of the most extraordinary sort of experiments in federal science and technology policy. And I'm going to offer you kind of a few data points to begin for why that's the case. But my talk will really be about, I think, what is a kind of hidden facet of this work, the ethical framing that I think is important. So this is Obama pictured with his science advisor, John Holdren, your colleague here. And it's really probably not since the influential tenure of Vannevar Bush in the US Office of Scientific Research and Development in the mid-20th century, during President Franklin Roosevelt's tenure, that science had played such a powerful role in a presidential administration. So Holdren was not only director of the Obama Office of Science and Technology Policy, he held other seats, two other hats besides. He was co-chair of the Presidential Council on Science and Technology, PCAST, in addition to being OSTP director, and led a national council as well. So it's a little clearer to see here than it is on my screen. So this is the configuration of the Obama Science OSTP. Holdren held the top three roles: OSTP director. He was co-chair of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, or PCAST, as well as chair of the National Council, Science and Technology Council. So in other administrations, different people had held all of these roles. Holdren held them simultaneously. You'll also see that the OSTP sort of built out lots of different work that included the STEM fields, energy science, climate science, cybersecurity, and the like. And a sort of phrase that came up often in folks that I talked to who worked in the OSTP was that science touches everything. So this was a kind of ethos of the Obama OSTP that part of the reason why Holdren and other people working in the administration would be sort of dual-hatted or tri-hatted in their positions in the administration was because they felt like there needed to be a kind of expansive and capacious way to how they thought about doing their work. So PCAS, this Presidential Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, were external advisors, right? These included folks like Eric Schmidt of Alphabet, Rick Levin, then president of Yale, who went on to Coursera. And you can see that in their work, they did some of the sort of work that gave framing and shape to some of the important initiatives of the Obama Office of Science and Technology Policy. So big data, K-12 STEM education, healthcare, and healthcare information, data informatics, and the like. So Holdren would co-chair this entity with Eric Lander and Harold Varmus. More generally, the Obama administration appointed many prominent scientists to his administration and to advisory boards, including 5 Nobel laureates and 28 members of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. Moreover, this PCAST was more active than any of their predecessor bodies in the 3 prior presidential administrations. So they, over 8 years, published 36 publications like these here. By comparison, there were about 12 in the Bush administration. There were 46 meetings over 8 years. By comparison, there were 30, 21, and 20 in the prior 3 administrations. And for the first time, members of PCAST were giving security clearances so they could offer advice to the president and his administration on cybersecurity and other important sensitive issues. So this was one facet of the sort of way that the Obama science apparatus, the way federal science under Obama was distinctive in the way that it was put together. Also distinctive was that over the course of the 8 years of his presidency, Obama published 13 journal articles, right? Many of these were kind of advocacy articles, right? So they're not putting us all to shame. They were commentaries, right? So Harvard Law Review, New England Journal of Medicine, Journal of the American Medical Association, Nature and Science, just to name a few. So these are just examples from late in his administration where he's trying to make the case for all that they did. He's tired, he's saying these are all the things that we did, including notably the commentary from the Harvard Law Review on criminal justice and the important work that his OSTP would do around forensic science. This would be the last paper that he would publish in Science, making the case for energy policy, certainly, in the weeks before the kind of Paris Climate Accord would fall apart. Then there was the kind of euphoria of the Obama administration that was also distinctive. So he brought to the White House for the first time the White House Science Fairs. They ran to really celebrate the winners of local and regional STEM and science competitions in K-12. And they ran from 2010 to 2017, and they've since they're no longer are going strong. So here's young Obama with not so much gray hair, with a young boy with a projectile. Older Obama holding a flu bug, a model of a flu bug in his hand at one of the later science fairs. So he would inaugurate them working with a gentleman named Kumar Garg, who worked for 8 years in the Obama OSTP, and this would be distinctive as well. So we got a sense of how distinctive the Obama approach to science was, because with the establishment of the Trump administration, it became very clear. So just to think about the staffers in the OSTP, at its height, there were 143 staffers. And when the Trump administration was established and came to the White House, there were about 30 staffers, and I think now that there are about 40. So it also gives you a scale of the kind of investment and staffing. What I want to suggest to you this afternoon is that there's a less obvious sort of impact or influence or something distinctive about the Obama OSTP and this particular federal approach to science, which was a kind of ethical framing, right? So I'm taking this up as a way to kind of frame a larger project, which is a book project that will be about moonshots. I'm working on about moonshots in the Obama administration. That will include the BRAIN Initiative, white papers and initiatives on big data and AI. the sort of first national nudge unit, a social and behavioral research team taking place in the White House, precision medicine, which I'll talk about today, and the cancer moonshot. So I'll draw, and in discussing this, as I said, I'll draw on some of the interviews I conducted, as well as content analysis, my own experience in one of the sort of ethical framing performances of the big data and AI, as well as quite a few of Obama's speeches, as you'll see, in his own presentation of self with regards to ethics and science. So the moonshot, of course, comes from a famous speech at Rice University in Houston, Texas, September 1962. John F. Kennedy ascended a podium in front of a large crowd gathered at a stadium at Rice, and really made the case for the goal of sending rockets and men to the moon, the goal of technological innovation, and the aspiration to use federal funding and federal human capital to do this in a limited time frame of 2 years. He says, but why, some say, the moon? Why climb the highest mountain? We choose to go to the moon in this decade, not because it will be easy, but because it will be hard. The moonshot, of course, has been taken up in other parlance. Of course, one of the Obama big initiatives and launched in 2016 with Vice President Joe Biden leading it is a $1.8 billion investment in cancer research called the Cancer Moonshot. It's also the case that the moonshot today is understood as being sort of any kind of ambitious project. The moonshot is used to talk about what was called Google X, now X, a sort of incubator project for innovative science and technology. But it should be noted here that the Google Moonshot are really about sort of a problem to sort of project to design to a sort of a particular kind of outcome that makes them a little bit different from the federally funded ones. Okay, so I want to suggest to you that throughout the course of his administration, and even in his time as senator, that President Obama very much understood, I think, two things, and we see them as well in his memoir, the sense that science was going to be important to his administration for reasons that I will say a little bit more about. But I think in his person and also in his presentation of self, as I said, it was very important for him to always give voice to the ways in which science had failed, and had been used for pernicious ways. So this is him from a speech in 2016. He's the first sitting president to visit Hiroshima, notably not to make an apology, but to give a speech. In this speech, he says, technological progress without an equivalent progress in human institutions can doom us. The scientific revolution that led to the splitting of an atom requires a moral revolution as well. Early in his administration, you may recall, he was asked to be a commencement speaker at Notre Dame, and it was highly controversial because he was an explicitly pro-life candidate and also a candidate who was committed to advancing, to a limited degree, stem cell research, which was a contrast with the prior administration of George W. Bush. So here, and part of what he says in his speech that day in May of 2009 is, let us be sure that all of our healthcare policies are grounded not only in sound science, but also in clear ethics. So I want to demonstrate today that the sort of ethical terrain that Obama and his administration endeavor to sort of work around and through is dealing with the past and sort of really having to reckon with the past, right? They have to overcome citizen skepticism related to the history of experimental abuse. They have to establish ethical regulations, in part so new science, new moonshots can go forward, and they have to generate a perception of ethical forethought, that the moonshots that they are proceeding with have been thought about, that these are considered moves. And in this way, they are distinctive from someone like Vannevar Bush, who I mentioned earlier. If you, in the historical archive, in the secondary literature about Bush and about the Manhattan Project and the formation of what would become the atom bomb, there are, I think, poignant reflections on this from, folks like Oppenheimer later, years later, only a few years later. What's striking to me about the sort of historical record on Bush is that there was never a sense in his conversations and in his work that, and certainly not in this masterful biography from Pascal Zachary, that they thought they should had to ask anybody, that there was any sense of accountability to, on the part of Bush, although it might have not been true of others on the Manhattan Project team, that there was anyone that had to be engaged in this process. And moreover, in some cases in the biography, Zachary writes about Bush sort of being asked whether or not there should be any kind of what we might call today sort of ethical engagement or conversation about whether or not this would proceed, and found it utterly unnecessary. So part of what we're seeing here, I want to suggest, is the sort of creation, an extension of an ethical frame that a few decades prior, and certainly a few presidential administrations prior, did not exist. And I'm going to track this for you in a few ways this afternoon, first beginning with the formation of the ELSI program that emerges alongside the Human Genome Project in 1990. Okay, so Human Genome Project begins, and soon after, there is a working group that would become a sort of project on the ethical, legal, and social implications of that project. Its original a mandate included sort of to identifying and defining issues that were related to the Human Genome Project, policies for addressing them, with 3 to 5% of the annual Human Genome Project budget, right? This has been discussed in some quarters as the largest ethics project in human history. So I want to bring to our attention that initially, the ELSI project, the ethical, legal, and social implications of the Human Genome Project, was actually quite broad and capacious, that it covered a lot of territory that it would not cover in the end, highlighting a little bit here for you. Privacy and fair use of genetic information with respect to employers and insurers, but also direct marketers, banks, credit raters, law enforcement agencies, and many others. The availability of large amounts of genetic information and largely unprotected data banks, possible discriminatory misuse of genetic information, and the fact that the use of genetic information in genetic screening could exacerbate the creation of a genetic underclass. But by 1991, the scope of ELSI is significantly narrowed. So the issues here are privacy and fair use of personal genetic information, genetics in the workplace, and genetic education. So you continue to see articles like this in the Human Genome News, which was the sort of official newsletter of the project. But the sort of, what we might call the sort of more radical interpretations of what ELSI might have been, and its ability to not only be downstream, as critics of ELSI would come to say, but also anticipatory in thinking about how genetic data might be used by, in the marketplace, for example, for purposes of bias and discrimination, are sort of shaved off of the scope of this work. So even though the work narrows from this initial mission, from this to this, it also expands, right? So by the early aughts, ELSI has gone from being a project that runs in parallel, kind of ethical analog to the Human Genome Project, to also being part of a conversation about nanotechnology. So it's expanding from the Human Genome Project to nanotechnology. Paul Rabinow and Gaiman Bennett in 2012 publish a fascinating, poetic, sometimes confusing book, but a very interesting book on their engagement and trying to sort of be an ELSI partner for synthetic biology as it's emerging a few years later in the early 20th century. So what we can track if we follow even the narrow ELSI is a sort of expansion of an ELSI frame, right, from the Human Genome Project to nanotech, synthetic biology, and other forms, right? So those of you who work in the life sciences know that there's pretty much the ELSI of everything. Any sort of project that you do can and often must, depending on who's funding it, have an ELSI component. And I want to argue that by the time we get to the Obama administration, that there's been a kind of full-scale ethical turn, such that to do federal science means to be expected to have some forms of accountability and to sort of be able to at least perform answers to certain questions about the implications of moonshots. Okay, so ELSI is one origin or one pillar of why I think this ethical framing comes to be prominent in the Obama administration. And another is the administration that preceded it. So here's Obama pictured again with John Holdren. Holdren, whom he appoints before he becomes president. So to give you a sort of comparison, George W. Bush didn't appoint or nominate and then have appointed his first director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy until almost a year into the administration. And we know, of course, that President Trump did not nominate someone until well a year into his administration. So it was really uncommon for someone to be nominated before a new president even takes office. And it's certainly the case that, as I said, early in his administration, indeed here in his inaugural address, Obama sort of places front and center his commitment to restoring science to its rightful place in his administration. Part of what that meant was a reaction to what they understood, Obama and many of his science advisors, to have been a politicized bioethics that emerged through by conservative ideologues during the Bush administration. For them, that was really summed up in the case of Cherry Schiavo. You'll see on her gravestone here that was commissioned by her husband. She departed this earth on February 25, 1990, right, and was at peace in March 2005. So between 1990 and 2005, of course, there is a contest between her husband, who said that to abide by her wishes would be to allow her to depart this earth in February 1990, and her parents who insisted on keeping her in a vegetative state, and then sort of all around a kind of raging public discourse about the right to life and the way in which this controversy was sort of abducted into that conversation. So as a senator, Senator Obama is already engaged in sort of trying to think about how to think about the relationship between religion and science, or religion and reason. This is a speech that he gives in 2006 in Washington, D.C. at a kind of ecumenical religious forum. He says, "I do not believe that religious people have a monopoly on morality. I rather have someone who is grounded in morality and ethics and who is also secular affirm their morality and ethics and values without pretending there's something that they're not." So part of a group of people, group of scholars, bioethicists in particular, galvanize around a project that they call Science Progress. And some of them would personally identify in contradistinction to those who were sort of bioethicists who were understood themselves to be conservative as progressive bioethicists, right? So two kind of exhibits A and B from this time period are these edited books edited by Jonathan Marino, a bioethicist, prominent bioethicist who teaches at the University of Pennsylvania at present, but at the time was a senior fellow and the founder of the Science Progress Project at the Center for American Progress. And here you see the kind of ELSI frame and a bioethics frame sort of expanding broadly, just in these two edited collections. So you have more than the life sciences here. They're talking about progress in bioethics and ethics frames around electronic medical records, solar energy, broadband, neuroscience, and organizational innovation. So it's a very kind of, the expansion of this ethical framing is happening here among other places. The Science Progress Project was launched under the presidency of John Podesta, who had been chief of staff under the Clinton administration, and was allowing these bioethicists to really sort of galvanize and sort of create programming and strategy around what they would want to do if, when the administration of George W. Bush and the sort of bioethicists, the conservative bioethicists who were advising him would move on. So what's interesting here are, I think, claims that are not always sort of associated with the left. So Science Progress understood that coming out of, I think, certainly the era of social movements of the 60s and 70s, that science had to be participatory, that it was inherently political. It was a project of progressive science policy, as I said. And they also understood or wanted to assert that one could combine ethics and innovation and ethics and reason, and that these things were not diametrically opposed. And this was part of the particularly progressive framing that they wanted to advance. So I should say that Marino, the editor of the co-editors of both of these volumes, the leader of the Science Progress Project at the Center for American Progress, would be a member of Obama's transition team from 2008 to 2009. John Podesta, who played a role here as well, by 2014 is working in the Obama White House and is working on many of the sort of moonshot launches, including the launches of the AI and big data sort of projects that happened around that time. So as I mentioned, it's also the case that Senator Obama was engaged in issues around genetics and ethics. So in 2006 and also in 2007, he introduces with Republican Senator Richard Burr of North Carolina the Genomics and Personalized Medicine Act, both of 2006 and 2007. And versions of this act would be introduced by other legislators after Obama entered the White House. But this was very much sort of front and center for him in his time, in his few years in the Senate. So what this act endeavored to do was to improve access, in its words, improve access to and utilization of valid, reliable genetic tests and to secure the promise of personalized medicine for all Americans. So while neither President Obama's bill nor the subsequent versions from him and other legislators were ever enacted, they did sort of, much of what was here was ultimately incorporated into the 21st Century Cures Act that was signed by President Obama in December of 2016, as he's towards the end of his presidency. And this 21st Century Cures Act, some of you might know, include not only the $1.8 billion for the cancer moonshot that I mentioned, but also $1.5 billion for precision medicine, for its infrastructure and for the larger project of it. Notably, Obama would note that it was important to him that a kind of ethical, you might say, guardrails were sort of placed around the issue of personalized medicine before it could move forward. So here's a report from the Gina Act, which I'll say a little bit more about, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act of 2008. And his reaction to it, according to a staffer, was that Obama said that he wanted to do the Genomics bill, this act of 2006 and 2007, but that he didn't want to go anywhere with it until Gina passes, sort of the sense that we had to have some sort of protective regulations in place before one could move forward. So the Gina Act, of course, in short, was signed into law by George Bush and enacted in November 2009. It protects against the use of genetic information to discriminate and the provision of health care, and also with regards to employment. All right, so moving forward, to 2015, January 2015, when President Obama in the State of the Union address would announce a $215 million investment. Later, by 2016, as I've just mentioned, in this 21st Century Cures Act, the total investment would be $1.5 billion. To launch this Precision Medicine Act. So he said, tonight I'm launching a new precision medicine initiative to bring us closer to curing diseases like cancer and diabetes. And I want to also highlight this second part, and to give us all access to the personalized information we need to keep ourselves and our families healthier. So on the one hand, a sort of research investment, on the other hand, a sort of a recognition that will become clearer as I go on about sort of the role that he's trying to create for the individual citizen, consumer, patient in a precision medicine initiative. So in brief, the Precision Medicine Initiative is a research endeavor that aims to understand how a person's genetics, environment, and lifestyle can help to determine the best approach to prevent or treat disease. Short-term goals, as announced by NIH, include expanding precision medicine in the area of cancer research and to increase knowledge of genetics and the biology of cancer. A long-term goal, bringing precision medicine to all areas of health and healthcare on a large scale. But all of this faced some of the hurdles that I mentioned previously. So just to repeat these, they needed to overcome citizen skepticism related to the history of experimental abuse. They needed to establish some ethical regulations, and the Gina Act of 2008 was a first step in doing this, and also to generate a perception of ethical forethought. So I'm going to talk a little bit about 1 and 3 now. So Obama announces in January 15, 2015, in his State of the Union address, the Precision Medicine Initiative, and a few days later, about 2 weeks later, has a launch event in the East Room of the White House. And here you see one of the things he does again and again, which harkens back to, some ways more or less explicitly, to a history of abuse, right, that would give people misgivings about precision medicine, and tries to encourage people that they should move forward. So he says here, at this launch, we've got to figure out how do we make sure that if I donate my data to this big pool, that it's not going to be misused, that it's not going to be commercialized in some way I don't know about. And so we've got to set up a series of structures. So part of the structures was a series of, this is a fascinating document on privacy and trust principles that at its most radical is asserting a sort of right to citizen science, a right for individual consumers to be able to use their genome and to have access to the information that their genetic information and genetic data might provide. It asserts a strong right to privacy. It asserts a kind of 21st century version of a kind of patient's Bill of Rights or a research subject's Bill of Rights. It's a very aspirational document, and indeed, it's a document without any legal bearing, so it's kind of all aspiration. But it's a very interesting historical document that I think that we'll be talking about for a long time, because it very much bears the imprimatur, I think, in some ways, of many of the kind of Silicon Valley diaspora that come to work in the Obama administration, that take pay cuts, who very much believe in the work that's being done here to advance science and technology policy, and bring with them, a very kind of romantic idea of what science and technology can do. Another quote from Obama that gets him in trouble: "I would like to think that if someone does a test on me or my genes, that's mine." But that's not always how we define these issues, so there's some legal issues involved as well. So, within a few hours, the New York Times is talking about how the president weighs in on data from genes, because as we know, as many of us know, your genomic data does not belong to you if someone captures it in a laboratory. And indeed, George Contreras, who's a law professor at the University of Utah, who I interviewed recently, who went to law school with Obama here at Harvard, at HLS, sort of writes this sort of rejoinder to President Obama that says, in part, US courts have repeatedly denied individuals censorship claims over data derived from their cells and tissue. Just imagine the chaos that would ensue if each of the million participants in the Precision Medicine Initiative could claim ownership over discoveries that were made after large pools of DNA were analyzed. So imagine indeed. So President Obama and his staff realized that they had to sell, for all sorts of reasons, they really had to sell it. So this is, as far as I can tell, the only of their sort of big projects that had two launches, right? So there's the January 2015 launch, that's a couple of weeks after the State of the Union address in which Obama launches this. Then there's a summit a year later, and which he engages researchers, some from the woman here from the Broad Institute, research scientists, to talk about in a public way, this was sort of live, this was streamed, what the precision medicine might be able to, initiative might be able to accomplish, but also to give voice from the perspective of patients, consumers, healthcare economists, what some of the challenges might be. So there's lots of conversation, most of it initiated by him, about privacy fears, about fears of genetic discrimination, about the need for new safeguards, and also the need for more nimble regulation if something like precision medicine should take off in the United States. A lot of this conversation, this is, I think this is fascinating. It's 42 minutes. It's really interesting because President Obama is on the stage with actual scientists and takes it upon himself to sort of talk about the science. So there's also this kind of odd, as someone who really admires expertise as he does, he's also very learned and really very much wanted to sort of demonstrate that he had learned quite a lot about genome-wide association studies and the need for diverse databases and all these sorts of things. So it's a fascinating kind of performance of the ethical framing that I'm talking about, and also just it's an interesting Obama presidency moment. So part of what they're talking about in this conversation is anticipation of a facet of the precision medicine initiative called All of Us, which is an endeavor to recruit 1 million people from the volunteers from around the United States to provide genetic data, biological samples, and other health information, because the genetic data is not useful without the other health information, and also to encourage open data sharing. So there's this kind of open science, citizen science piece of this that remains. Volunteers will be able to access their health information as well as research that uses their data. So as President Obama would suggest in this conversation, this summit, at which, again, they're really trying to sell people and they're trying to get people to overcome their skepticism variously about why this should go forward. So they're really selling it at the second summit. It's important that these be, as he describes, diverse databases, right? And so the face of All of Us often looks something like this. We need a 1 million person database that, quite frankly, is probably oversampled for people of color if the sort of types of big data analysis that wants to be accomplished can be accomplished there. And this remains a central issue. This is an article that a colleague, Malia Fullerton, published with a colleague in Nature about the sort of, called Genomics is Failing on Diversity, about the lack of diversity in genetic databases that really sort of gave a sense of urgency to the All of Us initiative and to okay, if it's the case that we need to have more diverse databases, how are we going to get there? This is data from the same article about the bias with regards to genetic samples, that there's significantly majority genetic samples of European ancestry that have obviously analytic implications for the import of the work if precision medicine works and if this precision medicine initiative is to go forward. So there's also there's a kind of fever, to get these more diverse databases. It's also part of the express mission of the All of Us initiative. But all of this is occurring against a backdrop in which other things with data are happening. So Nancy Sekola in the Wall Street Journal in 2013 would name Obama, I call him for this talk the Elsie presidency. She calls him the big data presidency, but not because of the PMI. She calls him the big data presidency because she's writing here about the NSA and about the sort of surveillance infrastructure that the Obama administration, another thing distinctive to science and technology in the Obama administration, expanded more than any administration prior. So all of us in the Precision Medicine Initiative are happening at a time where we have a ratcheting up in the public discourse of conversation about big data more generally and concerns about surveillance, both on the part of a kind of cybersecurity infrastructure and on the part